The Insta360 Ace Pro is one of the most interesting action cameras on the market right now, and in a lot of ways it is better than both GoPro and DJI. There's also a lot of settings, and some are not very intuitive to find. So in this video, I'll share my exact Insta360 Ace Pro camera settings that I use to film videos in regular lighting and in low lighting. I'll also show you several hidden settings that are very important to change, but not very easy to find on this camera. And I'll also show you how to use features that are exclusive to the Ace Pro, such as pause recording and AI warp. Now, I'm not going to go over every single button and setting on this camera. Instead, I'm going to focus on the settings that make the biggest difference for me when I'm out filming travel vlogs and videos. Starting with general video settings, this camera has a ton of shooting modes. There are 12 to be exact, but I mainly stick to a handful of them. You can cycle through the different modes by swiping left and right from the center, or tapping on the camera icon in the lower left corner and then swiping. The first mode that I use a lot is general video, which I use 75% of the time when I'm shooting travel vlogs and videos. Now, this screen layout is pretty much identical to the other modes that I use. On the bottom left, you can tap on 4K 30 to view the first round of settings. In the middle is video resolution. You can shoot as low as 1080p and up to 8K on the Ace Pro, but I prefer shooting in 4K because 8K files are really big, and there are very few displays out there that can even show 8K footage. Now for frame rate, it goes from 120 to 24. But note that 100 and 120 frames per second will turn your video into slow motion. There will be more slow motion settings later on in this video, but you do want to shoot at 60 frames per second or lower for a normal speed video. If I'm going to be shooting travel vlogs and videos, then I choose 30 frames per second. But for fast-moving action of any kind, then I bump it up to 60 frames per second. This tactic is again for saving space on my memory card and also for processing my videos faster. Up top, you can also select the stabilization mode. Insta360 products have really great built-in stabilization, to the point that you don't even need to use a gimbal or stabilizer if you're shooting in regular lighting. I always prefer having the highest form of built-in stabilization because why not? Especially since I don't see a dramatic cropping difference between standard and high stabilization mode. Next is ratio. I leave this on the default of 16:9. But you can also choose 4:3 or even 2:35:1 if you like the so-called cinematic aspect ratio with the black letterboxes on the top and the bottom of your frame. Note that all of these are horizontal aspect ratios. If you want to shoot vertical content with the Ace Pro, then you have to physically flip it on its side. Finally, we have the duration setting, which is set to infinity by default, but you can set it to different increments, like 15 seconds up to 3 hours, in case you want to press record and let the camera record for a specific duration. From this menu, swipe up to down to return to the main screen. Now in the lower right-hand corner are two icons. The first is Clarity Zoom, which is a unique feature on the Ace Pro because it crops into your shot without a loss in image quality. Tap the icon or double tap on the screen to punch in, but do note that it's not available in all shooting modes. Finally, the lowest right-hand icon is Field of View, which lets you choose between 4 FOVs, including Horizon Lock, De-Warp, Ultra, and Action. I shoot in horizon lock most of the time because it keeps my horizon level, even if my camera is slightly off balance, and there's almost no distortion in the shot. But occasionally, I will switch over to Ultra or Action field of view if I want a wider perspective, for say POV shots. But it does come at the expense of introducing some warp on the sides of your shot. Now before I dig into more video settings on this screen, I want to show you 3 very important settings that are somewhat hidden. The first is audio settings. Swipe down from the touchscreen and swipe right until you see this icon for audio. You can choose from stereo, wind reduction, or direction focus. Now since I typically film outdoors with this camera, I usually have it on wind reduction. Another setting that you may want to adjust if you have an external microphone connected is the microphone gain. Now below the audio icon is the gear icon. Tap and hit General, and then scroll all the way down until you see external microphone gain. I can't tell you the exact setting to use here because it really depends on what kind of external microphone that you're using, but you may find that the normal audio level is too soft. in which case you'd want to boost the gain. Or maybe it's a little too loud, in which case you'd want to reduce the gain. You have to kind of play it by ear and see what works for you. Now, after tapping on that gear icon, you can also scroll down to image settings. And here you'll find two other very important settings to toggle. The first is video sharpness, which lets you control the clarity or the level of detail in your video. By default, this is set to high, which you might think is good, but I personally never shoot in high sharpness on a camera because I find that the picture quality is often a little too sharp. And if you want to, you can always add sharpness in editing, but it's very difficult to reduce it once it's there. So I always set my camera sharpness to low. Quick update. After a recent firmware update, the sharpness toggle has now been moved into the general settings, so it's a lot easier to find. But the default sharpness is still set to high, so you might want to go in and toggle it. The final setting to adjust here is bitrate. Very simply, the higher the bitrate, the higher the video quality. So I always set the bitrate to high. Now that's it for the hidden settings on this camera. Let's go back to the rest of the shooting parameters on the main screen. From the main screen, swipe right and you'll find the controls for setting filters, shutter speed, and metering, and more. Let's start in auto mode first, which is what I shoot in 99% of the time. Tap on the first icon, and here you can choose from a variety of filters, such as vivid, flat, biking, urban, night, and ocean. I generally like to shoot in the standard profile, but if I'm doing a specific activity, like shooting underwater, then I might want to choose one of the ocean filters. When shooting in high contrast lighting situations with a lot of shadows, I'll often shoot in flat because this produces a low contrast image that I have more control over when editing. Since the Ace Pro cannot shoot in log, shooting in flat is a good compromise. The next icon is EV, or exposure, which lets you make your shot brighter or darker. I typically leave this on 0, but occasionally I'll go to -0.5 because I find that action cameras tend to slightly overexpose shots by default. Next is the metering mode, which I rarely see on action cameras, but it's a great setting to adjust. This is what happens when using matrix metering on the Ace Pro. But if you select face priority instead, then the camera does a great job of making sure that the face in a shot is always properly exposed. So when vlogging or shooting a person, this is the ideal metering mode. Next is the low light stabilization mode, which improves stabilization when shooting in low light. I'll talk more about low light settings later on in this video, but I usually leave this setting off as it can result in a darker image. And I think the stabilization in low light is fine without this setting, but be sure to experiment to find out what works for you. Finally, there is white balance, which you can manually toggle if you think that your color tones are slightly off. I always leave white balance on auto unless I notice really weird color tones in my shot. Now for so-called cinematic shooting settings. Let's back up and take a look at manual mode. There are only two settings here that are different: shutter speed and ISO. I would only touch these if you know what these terms mean and how they affect your video. But occasionally, I will toggle these if I want to shoot in so-called cinematic settings, which by definition is when your shutter speed is double that of your frame rate. As I mentioned earlier, my frame rate is usually 30 frames per second, so my cinematic shutter speed would be 1/60th of a second. If I select that, my shot will probably look too bright or too dark. So then I also want to adjust my ISO. I can do a manual selection or choose auto. I'll typically choose auto since that lets me choose a maximum ISO. Now the higher the ISO, the brighter the image, but also the more noise or grain that you'll see in the details. So for me, I like to stick with 3200 max ISO. Now when shooting in these cinematic settings, you might find that your image is still too bright. If this is the case, then you're going to need to use physical ND filters to darken your shot. And you'll also probably need a gimbal or a physical stabilizer for your camera. So again, I'd only shoot cinematic if you know what you're doing. 99% of the time, I'm shooting in auto and not in manual or cinematic mode. Earlier, I mentioned some low light settings in normal video mode, because you can do that. But the Ace Pro also has a specialized low-light shooting mode called Pure Video, and I recommend using it to get the best low-light image quality. All of the image settings here are nearly identical to normal video mode, but there are a few differences. First, the resolution is capped at 4K, and the frame rate is capped at 30 frames per second. There's no 8K or 60 frames per second shooting in this low-light mode. Also, there's no option to choose the stabilization level here, but if you swipe right from the main screen, you can turn low light stabilization on. I recommend doing this if you feel the need to. You also can't choose filters, so you cannot shoot in the flat color profile, which is a bit of a shame since that has resulted in better low light footage on other action cameras that I've used. Now another video mode that I often shoot in is slow motion. Again, you can shoot in slow motion in normal video mode by choosing a high frame rate, like 100 or 120. But often, I find it faster and easier to use the dedicated slow motion mode. When shooting in 4K, you're capped at 120 frames or 2 times slow motion. But if you change the resolution to 1080p, you can shoot even slower motion video, like 200 or 240 frames per second. This is to taste, but I find that 200 and 240 frames per second is a little too slow for what I like to shoot. So I typically stick with 4K 120 frames per second. Now the final video mode that I'll use on occasion is free frame video mode. But just note that you'll have to edit this video in the Insta360 phone app or the desktop studio app to take full advantage of it. When shooting in this mode, it gives you the flexibility to crop your shot horizontally or vertically, which is great if you can't decide your aspect ratio in the moment. Also, this is the only way to enable 360-degree horizon lock in video. With this mode enabled, you can twist and turn the camera in all kinds of directions and still end up with a perfectly level video. So if you want the ultimate flexibility in your video, then free frame mode is the way to go. Now that I've gone over image quality settings, let's also talk about a few general camera settings that I find helpful. And I'll wrap up with a few exclusive Insta360 features. The first general setting that I turn on is Quick Capture. You can get here by swiping down on the touchscreen, and the first icon is Quick Capture. Tap to toggle it on or off. When it's on, if your camera is powered off, then pressing the shutter button will turn it on automatically, and it'll start recording. This is a feature that I always have turned on for convenience. Next is Rotation Lock. When it's turned off, you can flip the camera sideways to change its shooting orientation, or shoot in vertical and horizontal. But when it's turned on, flipping the camera does not change the orientation. Since I rarely shoot in vertical, I usually have rotation lock turned on. Gesture control is next. This is also a unique feature on the Ace Pro that lets you do things like start and stop recording by holding up the palm of your hand, or taking a photo with the countdown timer on by holding up a peace sign. I love this feature and I always have it turned on. Next is voice control. If you toggle it on, then it shows you the commands that you can use to verbally control your camera. But since you can only use voice control or gesture control at one time, I usually have voice control off and leave gesture control on. Next up is pre-recording. If this is turned on, then the camera always records 15 seconds before you hit the record button. This can be helpful if you're filming action or unpredictable movements, so I might have it on in these kind of scenarios, but typically I leave it off. AI Highlight Assistant is the next icon. When this is turned on, the camera will automatically find the best moments in a video and show you a highlight reel that you can use as is or edit. This can be really useful for making quick edits on the go, so I leave this feature on. Now back out on the settings screen, you can swipe right to uncover even more, such as prompt sound to set the camera speaker volume. I don't particularly appreciate hearing the camera beeps and the shutter sounds, so I leave this on mute. Next to that is the indicator light, which controls the light bar that you find below the front screen. Now I find this to be a little too big and distracting, so I like to turn it off. But it can be useful if you've placed your camera far away and you have to visually verify that it is recording. Next is the setting for connecting AirPods if you want to monitor or record audio with them. But a fun fact is that you can also use this setting to connect the DJI Mic 2 transmitter and use it to record audio. The audio quality is not the best, but it does work. So I've already mentioned quite a few Insta360 Ace Pro exclusive features throughout this video, such as Clarity Zoom, Gesture Control, and AI Highlights Assistant, but there are a few extras worth mentioning. The first is my favorite, aside from Gesture Control, and that is Cancel Recording. Make sure that this setting is turned on by swiping down, clicking the gear icon, and going into General, and then toggling on long press to cancel the recording. Now if you ever mistakenly start recording, you can simply long press on the shutter button to instantly cancel and delete the current recording. I find this incredibly helpful because I often have a handful of mistaken recordings on my memory card, so this prevents me from doing that. The next feature is pause recording. It's also a favorite of mine because it saves memory card space and editing time in post-production. There are a few ways to use this feature. The first is while recording. You can tap on the red button at the bottom of the center to pause, and then tap the button or the shutter button to resume recording. You can also scroll through your album of previously recorded videos and click on the red button in the lower right corner to continue recording in that file. This is such a neat feature that has saved me so much time when organizing and editing my footage. Next up is Photo Grab, which lets you snap a photo when recording video in 4K 60 or below if you tap on the circle button in the bottom left corner. This only works in video and free-frame video mode, and it's really helpful if you want to save both a video and a screen grab photo at the same time. The next feature is the ability to turn the Ace Pro into a dash cam. You can technically do this with any action camera, but the Ace Pro has a feature that makes it incredibly easy to use as a dash cam. In camera settings, tap on Power Off Charging Settings and select Charge and Record. You can adjust the shooting settings and modes from here. When the camera is connected to an external power source, it will automatically power on and start shooting in the set shooting mode and parameters. Once the camera is disconnected from the power source, the camera will automatically stop recording, save the file, and start counting down to power off. The final unique feature is AI Warp. This is very fun to play with, and it's officially the only camera I know of that has AI capabilities built into it. You do have to process the video on the Insta360 phone app to do this, and it does take a little while to do it, but it's an endless source of entertainment and fun. So those are the exact modes and settings that I use when I'm filming travel vlogs and videos with the Insta360 Ace Pro. What's wild is that I've only scratched the surface of what you can do with this camera, as there are so many modes in here that I haven't even explained how to use, because that would make this video over an hour long. I hope that you found this video helpful. If you have any questions or you want to see more content about the Ace Pro, then leave your thoughts and suggestions down below. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.